ahead and get started.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited for today's session. My name is Alison Hamilton, and on behalf of the UCLA Rapid, Rigorous, Relevant Implementation Science Hub funded by NIMH, I want to welcome you to our session on strategies for selecting and using D&I theories, models, and frameworks. I am very thrilled to be sharing this workshop with Dr. Russ Glasgow. So I'll have him introduce himself in just a moment. By way of introduction, I am a professor in psychiatry at UCLA and research career scientist at the VA Greater Los Angeles. And I lead the 3R Implementation Science Hub. And I'm an anthropologist by training with a background in public health, health services research, and implementation science. And I love doing trainings like this and workshops like this. So very excited to do this one with none other than Russ Glasgow, who is such a huge pioneer in this field and just brings to us a wealth of information, wisdom, and guidance. So Russ, I will turn it over to you for an introduction.
Okay, great. Good, I guess afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. Thanks for the overly generous introduction. I'm just delighted to have the chance always to work with Alison on something. And I think I'm just going to give a caveat. I'll say that I direct our D&I program at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, but that you'll see in a moment acknowledgements, but I'm probably less qualified to do this than at least 4 or 5 other people, some of whom may be on this talk. So please be productive users of chat and that sort of thing as we go on. We'll love other people's input too. I don't think we pretend to know everything about this issue.
No, definitely not. Just when you think you know something, there's something else to learn. So it's constantly evolving, this area is. And speaking of chat, we will use chat. We're not going to, like when I'm presenting or when Russ is presenting, we're not going to pause extensively to answer questions in the chat. We'll tag team as we're going along as much as possible, and we'll also do our best to leave time for more open discussion, questions, comments, etc. too. As we do have possibly a couple hundred folks here, so that's a lot to manage in the chat, so bear with us. We will do our best, and if there are some questions that we need to respond to after, we can do that as well. So again, welcome, and we have not that much time to talk about a lot of interesting and exciting stuff. So we're going to get going first with just a quick feel for who all we have with us in the audience. And I do want to thank Elena Rosenberg-Carlson. Before I forget, who I should never forget, never could forget, who is my project director and is absolutely essential to everything that we do in the hub. So thank you to Elena, and she is going to help us with our first poll question about how familiar you are with D&I theories, models, and frameworks. All right, so we see we've got about 63% somewhat familiar, 13% very familiar, 23% not familiar. So that's fantastic. That means we have almost everyone in the not familiar to somewhat familiar, though I'm guessing that the somewhat familiar folks might even be more familiar than they think. But at least none of you think you don't know why you need to be familiar with them. So that's very interesting for us. We'll talk about why you need them, but I'm glad we're not seeing a whole lot of people who don't know why they came here today. So that's perfect. Thank you so much, Elena, and thanks for participating in the poll. And we just want to make sure to share with you our plans for the day and then our disclosures and acknowledgements briefly before we get started. So I'm going to get us going with an overview of D&I theories, models, and frameworks, and thinking about selecting them. And Russ is going to help us with combining and adapting D&I models. And we're going to talk really throughout about using and selecting measures for models. There's just so much that we could say about this topic. So I think we'll probably make this caveat a few times during the workshop that we can't possibly cover everything that needs to be covered or could be covered. And we really want to give an overview and some guiding principles, some ways of thinking about this. So it's not an exhaustive in any component of what we've put together for you, but we really wanted to make sure to cover as much ground as possible and get everyone's thinking going. And we really do look forward to hearing what you're working on and thinking about as well. So just in terms of disclosures and conflicts of interest, you see those here. One question that I think is coming up is whether this will be available. It will be available. It's being recorded, and we'll have a link later in the slide deck to our YouTube channel, our playlist of all of the offerings from the hub, and we'll also make the slides available. And then we just want to acknowledge our colleagues. I started writing a thank you bullet similar to Russ's. All of those people I would thank as well. And I think our list would get very, very long if we were to thank everyone who has informed us and influenced us and collaborated with us. So this is a big thank you to our colleagues, especially to those who contributed quite a bit of content to today's presentation, as well as our funding sources of relevance to this presentation. So thank you to everyone who knows who they are, who work with us, and also to our funders for supporting our work in implementation science. Okay, so we're going to start with an overview of theories, models, and frameworks. And of course, the most important place to start is with some definitions, because we want to get on the same page. Terminology can be tricky in this area because people use different terms, and you'll see that as we present different models, theories, and frameworks. Some of these terms are used interchangeably or rather non-specifically, and so that can make it a little confusing. We wanted to pull these definitions from Rachel Tabak's paper, which we'll be citing frequently. Definitely a key resource for you. If you haven't looked at that paper, we definitely encourage you to. But just to think a little bit for a moment about what each of these entities offers us. And then you'll see there are some variations on it, but theories are generally specific and predictive. So they have some directionality in them. They're very suitable for hypothesis testing. So you're looking at how maybe variables, if you're doing more quantitative work, are related to one another with an idea about how things connect and possibly produce outcomes. So there are many, many types of theories, and in each person's discipline, you're probably familiar with a whole set of theories that someone in another discipline is not familiar with, but they do have specific relationships and associations that are theorized to result in the end result, whatever outcome that might be. And they are very necessary as our models and frameworks for your implementation science work, because as I'll share in a few moments, what we're looking at in implementation is the process of change. And so starting with a theory of how we think things will change is really important stage setting for the methods that we choose, for the implementation strategies that we choose, et cetera. Models can also be specific and more prescriptive. A lot of models have some type of strategic or action planning orientation, and they help to provide a systematic way to develop, manage, and evaluate interventions. We'll show you examples of those. And frameworks, and you'll see a lot of back and forth between frameworks and models in terms of terminology use. Frameworks help to organize, explain, or describe information, and the range and relationships between concepts, including some which delineate processes, and they can be really useful for communication. So oftentimes you're going to see that one particular model or framework might incorporate all of these, some of these, one of these. We typically see that frameworks contain theories, but theories often do not have frameworks. So I don't mean to put a tongue twister there, but just to say that theories are not necessarily like phased approaches that you might see in frameworks, but you will see several frameworks that contain a variety of theories. And as the important point that Pernilson raises in another very critical paper in this area is that models and frameworks don't specify the mechanisms of change. So in many cases with the models and frameworks that are available to us in implementation science and D&I work, they're more like checklists of factors that are relevant to various aspects of implementation. And we'll get into this more as we go along. It is quite possible that you will need both a theory and a framework to guide your implementation work. If your framework does not contain a theory, then you may need a theory of how your intervention or your implementation strategies, for that matter, is going to change something. So that is a critical foundational piece, thinking about what is my notion, what is my team's notion of what is going to happen that will result in a particular outcome, a particular implementation outcome, an effectiveness outcome, et cetera. You have to work through your notions of what's going to happen, because of course, that concept of how change is going to happen affects how you lay out your study, who you need to involve, what measures you need, what approach you're taking is all going to line up ideally with that theory of how change will occur. The framework that you choose should be thought of as your friend, as something that will guide implementation. Most of the frameworks out there in implementation do have some type of phased approach. So that can really help you think through what's going to happen in, for example, pre-implementation, implementation, post-implementation, et cetera, which again really guides your choices in terms of methods and measures. You may actually design or combine, and Russ is going to talk about this a little bit later, you may combine theories and frameworks into something that you call a conceptual model. That conceptual model may include multiple theories and one framework. It may include one theory, one framework. There's a lot of variation in there. So that will be one of our topics for the workshop today, is this idea of combining theories, models, and frameworks, which I think is a lot more of what we're seeing these days in the field, which is very exciting. And very innovative. I think it can be complex. And so thankfully we have Russ to help us think that through, because he is one of the pioneers in blending and combining models and frameworks. So just to get us thinking about a little bit more about why we might need a model. Your first answer to that, if you've had some experience in this field, might be, well, I know I have to have one in my proposal. And I need to have some diagram, and I need to have something, I need to be able to identify a framework because that's what's expected. And that is true, it is, but let's think a little bit more foundationally about why this matters. So as I mentioned, in implementation and de-implementation and dissemination, you are trying to change something. That is at the heart of what we're doing in this type of work. You're trying to stand something up. Maybe in the case of de-implementation, you're trying to take something out of practice that is not evidence-based. Maybe you're trying to change organizational behavior, provider behavior, patient behavior, et cetera. But you are trying to change something and to address perhaps a gap or a quality issue, a performance issue, a lack of uptake of evidence-based practices. But we're in the business of change. And your theory of how change will occur is going to drive what you decide to do in your implementation work, in your research and your practice. So it's going to affect who and what you're going to target. And you may have multiple targets, for example, in the case of complex multi-level interventions. So there might be a lot of moving parts just right in that piece. It's also going to help you think about how you're going to foster change. And when we think about fostering change, we think about strategies. So if our theory is, I'm going to need to use these 3 strategies in order to get, this organization or these providers and staff, using a particular evidence-based practice, that has a theoretical basis because you're already generating this idea of how change might occur. Now, we're starting with theory in a more hypothetical or abstract sense, in that we don't when we lay out these projects and design them, we don't know what's going to actually happen. All we know is that whatever we thought would happen probably will not happen. We know to expect the unpredicted and the nonlinear that always happens in implementation. So we're putting our best ideas forward as to how we think change is going to occur. And then one of the important components of this that we'll talk about throughout the workshop is that we need to actually monitor and document and figure out, did things happen the way we thought they would? And when they didn't happen the way we thought they would, how can we account for that? What are the implications of that? What are we going to do with that information? How does it move us into the next phase, possibly, of what we're doing in our implementation work? Your theory is also going to inform your methods and your measures. So depending on which theory model framework you're selecting, hand in hand with that is the selection of methods and measures to help you figure out, is this happening according to plan? Where are things going off the rails? How might I understand those adaptations, adjustments, etc.? It's also really important to think about change as a process. So these models can really support you in parsing out your process into phases. And like I said, most frameworks that we are, a good number of the frameworks that we see in D&I work are phase-based approaches. And you'll see many examples of this in a few minutes. And I think, this might be a point of conversation for us as we move along today, but ideally your models that you selected initially and early on in your process of designing your implementation or D&I study can help you to interpret your study findings. Russ and I were corresponding about this a little bit and thinking we could be a little bit better about that, do more reflection on, did the model change? Was it a good fit? What was missing from it? What did you learn from, working with one model initially and then maybe seeing where maybe you needed to add another? This is a very dynamic area in general, and models, theories, frameworks change, and we can actually support that change through the consistent application, continuing into data analysis and interpretation. So there hasn't, I would go out on a limb and say we haven't done perhaps as much as we could to circle back to where we started. But I think there are more and more examples of this, and that can only help to enrich the field as we reflect back on where we started with our theories, models, and frameworks. So I mentioned Per Nilsson's paper, and you're going to see this a couple times in our session today. This is just the first 3 points, just reiterate much of what I was just sharing in terms of why do we need this? Why do we need models, theories, and frameworks? We need them to be able to describe or guide the process of translating research into practice. We need them to help us understand or explain what's influencing implementation outcomes. And then we also need to evaluate implementation. And that's a big role that our theories, models, and frameworks play for us, is in guiding and informing our implementation evaluations. He breaks down the models, theories, and frameworks that are out there into 5 categories that correspond with these aims. So process models, determinant frameworks, classic theories, implementation theories, and evaluation frameworks. We're going to look at these again later. But the idea here being that if you're looking to perhaps look at influences on implementation outcomes, you might be looking for determinant frameworks that give you those factors that have been identified as influential on implementation outcomes. You may pair a determinant framework with a classic theory, a theory of organizational change. Some of those have been developed in implementation science. Some have been developed outside of implementation science. A number of theories have grown within the field over the last couple of decades. And then, of course, we have very powerful evaluation frameworks, including Russ's Reaim framework that's been around for many, many years, that really started in public health and other fields that were doing a lot of program evaluation and had frameworks be generated that would help with the process of evaluation. There are several ways of thinking about categories of theories, models, and frameworks. This is a recent paper about using theories and frameworks in global health, and they do refer to the Per-Nilsson paper. And they're looking in a sort of interesting twist at the levels at which these theories, models, and frameworks are working and operating and helping us. And I love this quote that there is no such thing as a miracle theory or magic bullet framework, which is true. We wish they would just do everything for us, but of course we have to do the work to make them work for us. And so they look at 4 different types of models of causation in implementation science with a global health perspective, looking at intervention theories, frameworks, middle range theories, and grand theories or major social theories like symbolic interactionism, which again was not developed in the context of D&I at all, but there might be some major social theories that work really well with the work you're doing in implementation. And there's quite a bit of interesting thinking going on in relation to the incorporation of social theory into implementation. And they do a really nice job of looking at these different models with regard to fidelity, process evaluation, and complex evaluation. For example, pointing out that in many cases with our implementation work, we'll be developing some mid-range theories, trying to figure out that day-to-day implementation process, but that might lead us to a bigger unified theory of what's going on with implementation. So even though these are listed as separate, they are actually quite interactive. And it may be that you're working across multiple models in order to develop your categories, your theories, and an understanding of your outcomes. So the big question that we get when we're doing this type of work is, okay, I know that I should use them, but I don't know which one to use. And there is a lot of help available to you that we will be sharing with you. And this is, not a question that has one answer. That's why there are many tools available to help you, which we'll be going through during our session today, but helping you think through a strategic decision-making process for identifying a theory, model, or framework that will help you. I personally I don't like to use the same model, theory, or framework for every project. I suppose one could argue that you could do that, but I think you really need to look at your research question and look at the multitude of options that are available, which can be kind of overwhelming. That's why the tools that we're going to share are so helpful, so that you can really think about a fit between what you want to know, what you want to do, and what theory, model, and or framework is going to help you. Again, if we go back to Rachel Tabak's paper, which just has so much constructive information in it, she and her colleagues break down the decision-making process into 5 considerations. So you want to look at things like construct flexibility. So in other words, the constructs that are available in a model, and I'll use model as sort of a gloss so that I don't have to keep saying theories, models, and frameworks, but I recognize that that's choosing one and may not always be true to the name of a particular theory, model, or framework. But think about whether the constructs that are available to you in a model have sort of a broad applicability or maybe a bit more operational applicability, like a detailed step-by-step set of information about how to look into that construct. And again, there's not going to be a right and a wrong answer here. There's going to be a variety of options that you want to think about in relation to your research question. You want to address, are you doing dissemination or implementation? Think about what level of the socioecologic framework you're interested in, and you might be interested in more than one. So is the target of your work individuals? Is it organizations? Is it communities? Is it systems? Is it more than one of those? That's going to also guide your choice of model, because not all models are well suited to all of those levels. You want to consider whether you want to use something that exists or develop something new. I think we would say now and probably again and again that you most likely do not need to develop something new. There are so many available, so many outstanding models available, and the potential for blending and adaptation is quite high. So if you feel like, I'll share on the next slide, if you feel like 100 and something is not enough to choose from, and you really have something new to say, good luck. Make sure you draw on all of the models, theories, and frameworks that are out there that you are saying don't work for you. And you have to be very clear about why it's necessary to develop something new. I personally have never had a need to develop something new because there's so many resources available. I think really critical to your decision-making process is looking at how spelled out a particular model is. So some models are lovely and amazing and wonderful, but they haven't really been operationalized. So they don't have measures or instruments associated with them to help you dig into the construct. So it sounds good, it looks good, it's interesting, maybe it's theoretically really inspiring for you. But then if there aren't any measures or instruments associated with it, you would have to then do the work of figuring out how you're going to measure the constructs or assess them using qualitative methods, using mixed methods. How are you going to go about demonstrating the applicability of that model to your work? So this can be a pretty key decision point as to what's available along with a particular model that will help you with your application of it. There are so many to choose from. In Rachel's paper, almost a decade ago, there were 61. There are so many more now. Many implementation frameworks. In a Myers paper, there was very recent scoping review by Striffler and colleagues that identified 159 knowledge translation theories, models, or frameworks. So that's a lot to choose from. And needless to say, we are not reviewing 159 theories, models, and frameworks today. I intentionally put a lot of acronyms in that next point because that is kind of that feeling that you get when you start to look into all of this. You're like, wow, I don't even know what all these stand for. What are they all? Again, we're not going to get into every single one, but we'll share some of these with you. And it can be a bit bewildering. But the good news is that help is here. Thanks to the work of Russ and the colleagues who he thanked, and many, many others, too many to name, who have been putting incredible resources out there for us to have some support with this. So there is a website, the Dissemination Implementation Models, that Reaim and colleagues developed, that is absolutely remarkable, indispensable to my work. And Russ is going to walk you through all the steps that are available to you on that website to help you identify and potentially select the model that's going to work for you. There's a really excellent website on the University of Washington D&I Center that also can help with picking theories, models, and frameworks. And then there is a selection tool called the TCAS, developed by Sarah Birkin and colleagues, which has, again, a wealth of resources to accompany the overall tool, templates and questions that you can answer to help you identify the theory, model, or framework that's going to potentially work for you. So this is great news. This didn't exist years ago when we were doing this type of work. You kind of had to wing it and see if you could find the one that worked, or maybe stick with one that was well suited and that you were very familiar with. And now we have these really well elaborated tools to help us make these decisions, because it's just basically impossible to keep track of all the options that are out there, much less to think about potential combinations or adaptations. Russ, anything you want to chime in on here before I move into a few of the options?
I don't think so. I've been monitoring chat and trying to go back and forth, but I don't think there's anything critical. A couple of great questions you're going to address in just a minute. So
okay,
let's keep rolling now. We will monitor chat for key issues to come back to.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to share with you a few options. This is not even like the most slightest bit exhaustive, what the few that we're going to share. They are some of the more well-known theories, models, and frameworks. Apologies in advance for any that I do not mention, any that I do not describe. I am not trying to slight anyone. These are not in any particular, well, in the beginning, there are a few in order, just historically speaking. But we just wanted to bring up a few and hope that that prompts some questions and comments from all of you about your use of these. We'll ask a question later, which ones you're familiar with, that type of thing. So just make sure to be extra clear, these are just a few. We can't possibly go over 159 or how many ever there are, but we wanted to give a feel for what's out there and being, often used. And why I mentioned historically, the historical perspective is that so much of what we know about in implementation really goes back to the work of Everett Rogers and diffusion of innovation. And you'll see in many of the theories, models, and frameworks that have been developed since diffusion of innovation came out based on work in agriculture, that they incorporate quite a bit of the diffusion of innovation concepts and ideas. So you see things like characteristics of the intervention. These are pretty tried and true. We need to know what people think about a particular innovation that's being introduced. Is it better than what people are already using? Is it compatible with what I'm doing? Is it easy to use, hard to use? Can I see it work, et cetera? So there are some core concepts and ideas and principles from diffusion of innovation that have really stood the test of time. And it's quite interesting that this came from, implementation science was not around at this time, and it didn't even come up in the healthcare field. It really came up in looking at what was going on in the adoption of different practices in the agricultural industry, and not only understanding what's happening in processes, but also how can we figure out why there are some people who are like the first at the door to say, I want to use it, I want to try it. Those early adopters who are usually enthusiastic and just want to try anything, those are great folks, as is everyone else in this. Might have people who make their way into trying it, people who are a little bit late to try it, and then some people who maybe never try it. And these are all very helpful concepts for us in implementation science. I don't know if he will ever know what an impact he's had on our field. But this is a really major cornerstone of a lot of the theories, models, and frameworks that are out there now. Definitely Trish Greenhalgh built on diffusion of innovation principles and concepts in her work, her colleagues' work about diffusion of innovation in service organizations. I feel like every time I look at this, I look at it pretty regularly because there's so much in it. I feel like every time I look at it in the context of a different project, something else I'm working on, I see something new, I think about something new. So even though it's old, as my kids might say, wow, that's really old, Mom. It has a lot to consider in it, a lot of food for thought. And you, again, will see that many of the components of this particular model are available in other theories, models, and frameworks as well. And Laura Damschroeder noted in her original CFIR paper, Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research paper, that this was a starting point for the CFIR. So I believe that Greenhalgh and colleagues looked at across about 500 different sources about these issues of innovations, readiness, communication, context, et cetera, to put this together. And this was a starting place for what Laura and her colleagues put together that many of you might be familiar with, which is the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, or CFIR. There's much to say about this, as every other model and framework that we'll share with you today. As some of you may know, the CFIR is broken down into 5 domains, and it specifies constructs that are believed to influence implementation. What it doesn't do is specify the interactions between those constructs, and they make a really important point in the paper that the theory part can go hand in hand with the constructs. So the idea is, here are the constructs as organized in CFIR, which involve reviewing, I believe, over 100 different approaches to understanding implementation to come up with these 5 domains. And then the theoretical work is on us to figure out, how do these mechanisms work? What are the mechanisms of change? What are the interactions between these constructs, et cetera? So it's not it's not theoretical by any means, but the idea is really that you would take constructs within CFIR and then develop theories about how the constructs relate to one another and influence implementation. You may also be familiar with the Epis framework, and again, I can't possibly do justice to any one of these frameworks. There's so much to say about each of them, so we just wanted to highlight a few key points about some of the ones that we're sharing today. This was developed by Greg Ahrens and colleagues, and one of the things that I think really stands out for me with Epis, again, very well elaborated, lots of resources available, lots of thinking related to Epis and application of it across many, many different service sectors, including outside of healthcare. But they have a component in Epis about bridging factors that I think is really interesting. There have been some great papers very recently about looking at bridging factors. These are the connectors between inner and outer context, and we know that they influence implementation reciprocally. And I think that this addition to the Epis framework really advances our thinking in terms of the non-boundaries, let's say, between inner and outer context and innovation factors. Again, much to say about this. There are a couple of references there about the bridging factors and many more available, and we can provide more if you're interested. You also may be familiar with the Paris model, which stands for promoting action. Sorry, I made a typo there. Promoting action on research implementation in health services, and the iParis is the integrated Paris version that you see here. There's a simpler version that you can see, but this is in the supplemental material to this more recent paper by Harvey and colleagues. You'll see here again that there's a focus on context, inner context, outer context, the innovation itself, and who is receiving the innovation in terms of recipients. One of the key constructs in the iParis framework is facilitation. So they're really looking at the relationship between innovations, recipients, and context in relation to facilitation. So if facilitation is an implementation strategy that you're interested in, that you're considering using, this might be something to look at, because the facilitation dimension of it is very well spelled out. As you can see here in the blue, we're looking at what the facilitator looks at, and in the red, what the facilitator does. And this has been, again, applied in many, many different studies. So you have yet another example of a model that has quite a bit of literature related to it and a lot of guidance related to it as well. Definitely would not be complete without talking about Prism and Reaim. You have the world's expert on this with us in the workshop, so I'm not going to speak to this too much now, but Russ will be coming back to this. And I did want to note that there is a new website tool that goes along with Prism Reaim. And this is going to come up again when Russ talks about blending models and frameworks as well. So this is just a little snippet of the new website. Highly recommend taking a look at all of the resources that are available in here. And also wanted to point out the VA Quality Enhancement Research Initiative, or QUERY, implementation roadmap that was developed by Amy Kilborn and colleagues. There are quite a bit of tools that go along with this as well. And you see that the phases are indicated: pre-implementation, implementation, and sustainment, and also the dynamic nature of these phases and what happens in these phases as, again, very reciprocal, very cyclical, and iterative, about really thinking through what's happening in each stage and how does our ability to address that move us toward change, toward improvement, and also toward sustainability. And then I'm going to wrap up our quick overview of theories, models, and frameworks with a couple of equity and implementation frameworks that have been published rather recently. Eva Woodward's and colleagues' Health Equity Implementation Framework, is getting a lot of attention, rightfully so, as the field moves more and more toward an explicit accounting for disparities and for the need to move toward equity in healthcare. So there's a really nice blending here of concepts from equity literature and research and principles, merging them with implementation processes and outcomes. And Rachel Shelton's and colleagues' enhanced Reaim sustainability and equity model, which again has more on sustainability. And I didn't put in a lot of sustainability models. There were many more we could have put in, but we just don't have time to cover them all. But the case with both of these models and frameworks is that they are putting health equity issues front and center and really integrating them into the way that we think about implementation. So again, we probably still have that question. That's way too much. I still don't know how I'm supposed to choose my models and frameworks. And we thought we would just revisit a little bit of the per Nielsen categories. Again, you have all these options down on the bottom in terms of process models, determinant frameworks, et cetera. And also Laura Damschroeder's recent paper, Clarity Out of Chaos, which is an absolutely perfect title because there is a lot of chaos in this area. But you see here similarly that there are determinant frameworks, process frameworks, and evaluation frameworks. So before I turn it over to Russ, we just wanted to emphasize some really important points that Russ will also speak to. That models evolve and change, and that some of that evolution is really coming from powerful critiques in the field about what are we doing theoretically, what role is theory actually playing in implementation science. Recommend that Kisloff paper along this line because there's so much great thinking going on in there, and Russ really reflects on 20 years of using Reaim and evolving it in very powerful ways. Also, we want to just make sure to make the point that as you have probably already seen, or maybe have seen in your own work, many models fit into more than one category. So even though they're sort of broken down into determinant and process and evaluation, a lot of the models that we see out there do all of this work. So you may be able to rely on one or two models, theories and frameworks. But even, the categories are there as helpful guidance, but we don't want them to become too rigid so that people feel like I have to have one of every one of these and I have to do this in this specific way. There's still a lot of creativity available and a lot of blending and integrating available to you. So I'm going to turn it over to Russ now.
Well, thank you. Maybe Alison, if you think so, and Elena, I'm looking at the clock, maybe we could pause for 1 or 2 minutes. I'm afraid we don't have more than that. We want to get there, but if there are any burning issues, I've tried to keep up in chat partially, but please maybe either write in if there's any key things, or I don't know if you've been able to track Alison at all, chat.
Not at all.
You're talking or not.
I've seen nothing.
Yeah.
Just busy. That's busy, but I haven't seen what anyone's been saying.
Okay. Many of these I think actually are going to be addressed, or frankly, maybe are unsolvable, or at least challenges that we continue to work on. Why don't I go ahead and power through the next few things? I think it will address a few of the issues that have come up, and then Alison, you can help us out in chat, and including, interrupt me if there's a key point. This is one of my favorite slides, and we're still tracking down the actual origin of it, but we think it's this paper here that I had a hard time getting, but I'm looking up and starting to read now, a real provocative paper, and you can see the title of it is Spherical Horses and Shared Toothbrushes. So I love the title, but there's this notion that given all the challenges and all of the intricacies and things, is most of us end up using the model either that we've been taught, their framework, or just the one that we're the most comfortable with. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but I don't think it should always be the automatic default that you just use one. I think you'd be limiting yourself if you did that too. So next slide, please. Okay, yeah, so why don't you go ahead and do this as I'm talking? It would just be interested to know the group, which one that you used here. I don't know if you'll be able to put in all the factors that you chose, but maybe if you could just give a bullet point, which theory, and then why you chose that. But we'll go ahead while you're doing that, but that will be interesting to come back to.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is one approach. We're going to show you a couple of others that you can consider questions here that will really help you at least narrow down. So I said in chat, from my perspective, there's not one right answer, but these type of questions can really help you narrow it and, you know, reflect a little bit too. I think the only thing that I don't see here in a quick scan is you might just also consider if the model has been used in your content area. Like there was a chat there about a technology model or something. We'll talk a little more about equity models, but I might add that. But I think these are good issues. There'll be a couple other checklists that I'll turn to in a moment. Okay, so here is what I'm going to spend most of my time on, and I'm going to go way too fast because we want to talk with you, but I encourage you to go ahead. If you're good at multitasking, you can do this as we talk. This is the latest update of this tool that Borsika Rabin is the primary player, but all of Roch Brownson, Rachel Tabak, myself, and people that I'm probably forgetting here have been real intimately involved in. So take that, you know, with that potential conflict of interest that I'm disclosing now. I will say one exciting thing about this that we're working on right now with the new supplement from NCI is to try and both add more models to it. I think we have 110, but what's more interesting is we're trying to explicitly add in health equity models and to code them for constructs related to D&I, and conversely, to take the 110 some D&I models we have in here and to code them for health equity constructs. So more to come on that. It'll probably take us a year, but we're very excited about that. So next slide, please. So the way that this model works, this is kind of the second to the homepage, I think, is a series of steps that we kind of guide the user through. And there are a number of, there's a couple videos to help you. And then there are a number of fillable PDFs at each of these buttons. If you notice the buttons going across the bottom here to kind of help you personalize and answer some of these questions that you just saw on the slide before. So let's go to next slide or two. I'm going to go in a little bit of detail, and then I'll go very rapidly over the last 3 or 4 slides. Okay, so we start with a logic model here. And again, that's not the only way to do it, but we find it very helpful. And for those of you that aren't familiar with logic models, I'll show you a couple of examples here, but I think they're being increasingly used kind of like diffusion of innovations. For those of you that have a public health background, they've probably been used for 50 years. So it's nothing new to you, but we find it very, very helpful. So next slide, please. So here's a kind of prototype early one. This is probably taken out of some public health text. I don't know which, but the notion is, although it's not a totally linear process at all, the notion is it starts, and maybe even from an assumption or a problem, Enola Proctor would say, basis on the left-hand side, to then think about what resources do you have, how does this lead to activities. There's both kind of short and longer term outputs and outcomes here, and then the ultimate impact. So next slide. Here's just one quick example that I'll go over to just have you see some keywords there. I know you can't read it, but to give you an idea about working from the inputs to outputs to both proximal and longer term outcomes. Next slide.
And just one quick note on this one, Russ, because it was one that I built in the activities column. We used the phases from the model that we had selected, the program change model, to organize the activities. So you can infuse the logic model with the framework that you selected. If it has, for example, if it has phases, it can be really helpful to break down the activities into those corresponding phases to map back to your framework.
Thank you so much, Alison. That is great. And also this one, again, you'll have the slides. I know you probably can't read all of it, but has some nice specifics to also illustrate how. In the tool, we do have one or two other examples too. I forget which model we use there, framework, but next slide, please. Thanks. So this is the one that we use. It's not necessarily, it's certainly not the only one, not necessarily the right one, but this is used to kick off in this planning stage of how this tool works. So what we ask you to do is fill this out. Again, there are some examples in a video, but you kind of fill in the blanks here within each of those ovals about what is your problem. If you know what the evidence-based intervention or policy is, and then you can see, you fill in the other ones here with what you think are the key issues. I will note just one thing that's a little different maybe about this one than most logic models I've seen are the things in kind of the center or the bottom, is it explicitly focuses not just on context, and we mean context broadly, but it's a dynamic context, and I think impacts at all stages, not just initially. Often we look at context initially, but throughout, and then we do use somewhat self-centeredly a construct from the Prism model that Alison mentioned briefly that we call the sustainable, it's actually implementation and sustainability infrastructure. A kind of a typo there that we feel is really important is, are there resources and activities and structures in place to influence longer term outcomes? Anyway, you fill this out as best you can. Next slide. And well, let's see, this is one alternative model, and frankly, it's more broadly used in implementation science than ours is. The key focus here, this is J.D. Smith and colleagues, and some of you may have used this. It's pretty widely used in HIV, I think, and maybe even in your group or hub, you've used it. It focuses more on mechanisms. I think mechanisms are in most model, but focuses more on mechanisms and a little less on outcomes than some of the other models. So now let's go to the next slide and we'll get back to the, nope, here's one more example trying to give you that's a specific HIV one. And I don't know, Alison, do you want to add anything about it before we go on?
Just that this comes from one of the Ending the HIV Epidemic projects, Laramie Smith and Jill Blumenthal, and just shows an application of JD's implementation research logic model in the context of the projects that we're supporting through our hubs. So a really great example. And I would just also note that the paper, the original paper about the implementation research logic model has really helpful templates and fillable forms. And so there's just support for so many of these things, as you've seen through the website that Russ is sharing with us, through this paper. And so lots of tools to help you work your way through this type of thing.
Great. Okay, so now we're going back to walking you through this step. We're kind of working on select now in this, this tool. And the way it helps you is after you fill out, well, actually as part of filling this out, you maybe can barely see in the bottom right-hand corner, there are a whole list of constructs that you can select, and you use the logic model to select these constructs. And there's some other issues there also about the socio-ecologic level and how much you want to emphasize initial implementation versus sustainment, things that you kind of answer some questions, and then that feeds into an algorithm that is largely driven by the constructs you have in the logic model, and then it will return in ranked order the things that you might want to most consider. Again, it's not going to tell you the model, but it's going to tell you, if you will, which models the top have the greatest number of hits, given the issues that's basically the way it works that you're concerned about. Next slide, if you would, please.
I think this might be kind of the same as the last one.
It's the
just with
same one. Thank you.
selection,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I didn't even see that it had changed. So thanks for prompting me so I didn't sit there for 5 minutes. So I'm going to just go to the next slide, other than recommend. This is one other approach for that will show you a specific checklist that we kind of like. Here it is from Moulin et al. That you'll answer a series of questions. You actually go through this to fill it out. That also can help guide. The other thing is, earlier, Alison mentioned, Sarah Birkin and colleagues have a nice web-based tool called TCAST that also asks you a series of questions that you kind of answer. It's more like after you have maybe selected an initial one, you want to try out or check against it to see if it's answering certain criteria. Next slide. Okay, so backing up a little bit, we've just thrown 100 things at you. This is just kind of, I guess Alison and I made this up together. This doesn't come out of any, highly cited article or anything, but some key issues that we think about that are important, and I'll spend just a minute on them. One is almost all of our world, at least to my way of thinking, is multi-level. And so rather than just thinking about something that applies just as often, I think we can, like a particular setting, like a primary care level or a hospital level or a work site, thinking about the multi-level, both higher level and lower level, who are the different stakeholders. Second, context is about everything. Almost all of these models have something about context, but they do it in a different way. So thinking about how it fits your context. Somebody asked before on the intuitive. I think that and pragmatic is one issue that if you want to use this with stakeholders, which I would encourage, some of those we've just found kind of overwhelming to try and use or be overly academic for stakeholders, but there are ones that at least the central constructs, you can do that. So that's one factor, not all. Another one that's a challenge, the notion of measures. There are not measures for a lot of the constructs, or if they are, they're really impractical measures. Like there's a 120 item measure that you can have of something. Well, that's great, if you have college students, but if you're working with real world people, probably isn't going to work. And then this bottom line is fit, which also is in the eye of the beholder, but these tools that we've just talked about try and help you with that. Next slide. Okay. So again, I think to put things in perspective and to so we don't get too much hubris here, I think it's sobering to kind of have these classic questions from H.L. Mencken and George Box here, just to realize none of these are going to work perfectly. None of these should be reified. Most of them are and should be works in progress and evolve over time in response to data and things. But that while none of them are perfect, they're all wrong, some of them may be useful. And again, what we're trying to do here, and particularly some of these tools we've talked about, are to kind of help you figure out and often adapt it so it'll work better for you. Next slide. Alison, I'm doing a check here. Elena, if we want to pause for questions here, I'm kind of watching the clock, or if you think we should power through the remaining ones that we want to get to.
I think we're probably okay to power through and then have maybe roughly 10, 12 minutes at the end.
Tell you what, I think let's try and save at least 15. I think at some point I can just stop if I rattle on, and then we can maybe go to the last slide or two. And then I know you and Lena have some things you want to share at the very end. So
sure,
let me try and power through even faster than I normally speak here. Again, seldom, as Alison said, are you going to find one that just is the perfect, cat's pajamas that is just absolutely fits your setting, your population, your intervention, your implementation strategies want to do. So often we're with the issue of combining and adapting models here. And again, this website takes a shot at that. Frankly, this is still a work in progress, but we lead you through a series of questions, have some examples. Again, there's some fillable PDFs that you can do to answer some questions about combining or adapting. Next slides. These I'm going to skip given the time, but here are both some rationales for when you want to combine a model. And again, like selecting a model, generally don't adapt it unless there's a need to, but here's some questions and reasons why you often need to. Next slide. Some more, and many of these issues for combining are also reasons for adapting. And I think we've had some discussion in chat already about that. So next slide. Okay, so here are some considerations when you do, and also some maybe tips from review experience so you don't get beat up when combining models in review. One thing is, I would say for each model that you add, the bar gets a little higher. So that you really want to demonstrate that there is incremental value. Almost always and frequently we see combining a couple models, and maybe one of the most frequent is combining, what Nielsen calls a determinant model anyway, or maybe an intervention model with an evaluation model. But you do need to justify this, and usually you confuse both reviewers, let alone stakeholders, if you try and combine more than two. So I guess that would just be a caveat there and some things to think about. Next slide. Okay, adapting models, similar things here. Again, just show you there's a separate section on the website, but many of these issues are overlapping. Next slide. So we like to think about, again, oversimplifying, but green light, yellow light, red light adaptations of a model here. And you want to be very careful going to the red light about changing. If you're really going to say you use this model, be careful. You really don't want to change the core principles or issues or the underlying core constructs about that. That's probably a no-no. But there are some other yellow light things that you can do where you're maybe adding a construct in particular, or maybe you need to redefine one, or you're shifting the focus. Maybe it's been used largely for adoption and now you want to use it for studying sustainability. And then there's green light adaptations that almost always, particularly to fit your particular setting or application, I think there. The other thing is that we see far, far too little of is actually formal testing, frankly, of either models and theories and frameworks in D&I, but also particularly adaptations. Again, if you can, it's not always easier, but rather than just saying I adapted this, or I combined these models, it would really advance the field if you could actually demonstrate empirically that made a difference, that improved over just using the basic model, or in this case, the non-adapted model. We can maybe come back to that. Next slide. So here's one key take home. We're starting to get there, is that more important, Alison, jump in here if you disagree, but more important to me than which model you take is that you use the model throughout. You're not just talking about it in your background or even how your intervention fits it. It's certainly critical, it needs to be part of your aim, but it also should be integrated throughout here, what you're doing in terms of how your design is testing it and the methods, especially the measures. One of the things, my little pet peeves that irritates me is somebody says they're using a model and we've got these key constructs, then you get through and you look at the measures or the assessment section, there's nothing in there about those constructs. It's more just a traditional, health outcome or something like that. But to me, this is one of our key take-home messages. So, Alison, do you want to jump in and either disagree or concur?
Definitely concur. I think one of my peeves, in addition to yours, which I also have, is analysis. Yeah. So you might even do a great job of tying your methods and your measures, maybe your strategies, hopefully, to the model that you selected. And then sometimes when we're reviewing these types of proposals, the analysis section is totally generic. So it doesn't say anything about how you're going to actually analyze the data, especially if you have a mixed methods design. What is your plan for integrations? This is on my mind because I've been teaching mixed methods this week, and thinking about what are you doing across your methods that will hopefully lead you to interpretations and conclusions, but even your plan for that needs to be articulated. So if you set up an integrated mixed methods evaluation, really thinking through analytically, what are you going to do to tie together your data sources from your quantitative and your qualitative methods to yield a mixed methods integrated set of results. Your intention for that needs to be thought through very, very early. And when I see analysis sections that are, just sort of, we're going to code and we're going to do such and such analyses, but there's no reference to the model, that's a missed opportunity to show that your thinking has translated through all of these different components of your design, all the way through your analysis plan.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for adding that. I just noticed one thing in chat, and we'll have to go on. I think increasingly, many of us are really interested in adaptations and the issues of understanding them, tracking them, thinking about when they're good, when they're bad, maybe can we guide them? And I think that's a nice example, maybe combining models and focusing particularly on some measures and things is taking one of the adaptations models, whether it's Frame or Frame IS or other ones, and using it to kind of expand your model. Next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think I am going to just turn to the next couple examples, but the last part of the after use of this website is measurement. And again, I think that's a rapidly evolving area in our field. And there are two resources that I'd particularly recommend. There may be others. If you know of others, please put them in chat. But if we can go to the next two slides in order. This one is an NCI resource. It's been available now for, gosh, almost a decade. Again, I'm going to credit our colleague Borsika Rabin started it out through a supplement through NCI, but various people have worked on it. And there are measures here, not just D&I measures. There are D&I measures. There's also a subsection here on measures that are patient report measures that are really, really brief and concise and pragmatic. That can be used in EHR. There's others that are even more basic science, but grid-enabled measures database here. Many of the things, caveat, are a little dated there, but there is a function in there where you can add measures that you want or comment. We tried to do a bit of an early crowdsourcing thing that didn't work that well, but you can see about the measure, get a copy of the actual measure, see what others say about it, how it's been used. It's a little spotty, to be quite honest, and could be an update that might be something one of our center grants is going to work on. Next slide. The SIRC, Society for Implementation Research, has an incredible project that they've been doing over the years, collaborative project. I'm sure some of you on this call have been involved with that. And they've developed an instrument repository. They've used CIFAR. So most of the models they have are organized along CIFAR constructs. So that's one, either a limitation, or if you're using CIFAR, it's a wonderful advantage because it goes into detail. And they would say the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of them have to do with mental health type issues. I think some substance use issues too, but that's been their focus. They couldn't do everything in the world, but they've done this incredible job of reviewing and really thoroughly reviewing models. And they have this wonderful rating scale or system called PAPERS, which it combines looking at, if you will, the traditional psychometric criteria that you look at for models, internal consistency and reliability. But, and this is what I love about it, in addition, it also has a number, I think 5 criteria for how pragmatic is this, how feasible is this to use in the real world? How long does it take? How much does it cost? That sort of thing. And so you get this profile that shows both. Again, no measure is perfect, kind of like a model, but it'll show you where does it fit kind of on this continuum. How does it meet kind of the traditional psychometric criteria? To what extent is it pragmatic? So I find this wonderful. One caveat with it is you do have to be a CIRC member. And maybe somebody can put into chat what the charge is, at least now. I know there's been some discussion, but now it's not, unlike the NCI one, it's not free, but somebody can enter into chat, or if it's recently changed, correct me on that. but it's wonderful if it fits. Next slide. Okay, I think we made it, Alison.
We made it.
I
That's
think
incredible.
Take-home points. I'm
Amazing.
going to do this. I'm going to just not read these, but emphasize one or two. Alison, why don't you emphasize one or two, and then I think we can open it up for however you want to do that for discussion here. So let's see. The ones I'd like to emphasize are, I'm going to come back to this third to the bottom one that both Alison and I talked about. And I think, again, from what I've seen at study sections or journal reviews, or this is the thing that gets people in trouble in the most. You know, if you're going to use a model, use it and use it throughout. Don't just kind of give lip service to it or use it early on. I'll add one thing that isn't on here, but that is another one of the issues that our Reaim group has been struggling with. And that is that we feel that you don't need to use every aspect of Reaim or Prism. We're now using Prism. If anybody has questions on that, I'll be glad to take those. Prism now brings context to Reaim and integrates contextual factors with Reaim outcomes. But very often we see people say, well, I have used Reaim model, and then you look at it and maybe they used reach, but they didn't use any of the other 4 outcomes. They didn't use any of the Prism constructs. And kind of my evolving position is that's okay, but say that and fess up, like say, we took this aspect of Reaim, or we took this aspect or section from the model, but don't say I used the entire model. And I think that issue is even more true for something like CIFAR or the Greenhalgh's model, which in my experience is virtually impossible to measure every single thing, you know, that you want to in a study. So that's kind of one of my pet peeves. It's totally fine to do that. And then I'll just add one other thing that I think was in there, but we kind of went right over it, is to be a bit provocative or heretical. Is I think sometimes it's perfectly fine, here's the heretical part, not to use a formal theory model or framework, but to use a really good logic model, if that fits. And again, even if you don't, I really am a fan. I think it's helpful for a reflection process to first fill out a logic model and then think, as this website does that we use, about which model fits the best. Again, that's, people vary a lot on that. And some people think it's the kiss of death if you don't use a formal theory model or framework. But I'm not recommending you do that routinely, but sometimes I think that can do as well, even if you, or especially if other more formal theories, models, or frameworks don't seem to work. They don't seem to click. So Alison, I'll turn it over to you. Your turn to editorialize here, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, I mean, I would really pick up on the same point that you did. I think these other points we've been making throughout, and I think it bears repeating that you do not need, I don't think you need to use the whole model necessarily, and in many cases it's going to be impossible to do so. So you just want to be very explicit about why you're not addressing certain constructs. If it's outside of the scope, if it's been addressed somewhere else, there are a number of rationales, you know, that make sense for why you might not use the whole thing, but you really need to be specific about it instead of ignoring part of it and not, you know, mentioning that you ignored it. And then your reviewers will say, well, why didn't you do this? Or where is your work on this particular component of a framework or model? So I mean, I've done that in many proposals, and you know, it doesn't always work perfectly because maybe the reviewer thinks, well, you should be doing that and you're not, and why not? But at least you're putting it out there that the thinking is there, the rationale is there, and then, you know, of course, as with everything, it's open to critique and to improvement. But everything else here, I think we've covered really well in terms of, you know, well, I mean, I hope we've covered it well. That was our goal, was to cover, you know, that there are a multitude of theories, models, and frameworks available, and that, you know, it's really about fit, to go back to Russ's earlier point, fit with your research question, and just being very thorough and explicit and articulate about what you are doing. And if you're combining why you're combining would be a very important point to make, and how you're combining is also going to be really critical. I know we're going to have some folks kind of move on to their next meeting, so I just want to take us through a couple of quick, more admin type slides, and then we'll open it up to more questions. This won't take long, but we would love to know for our hub what you would like a future workshop to address. These are just some options that we have some expertise available to do. So there could be many other things, but if you could just give us a feel for other workshops that you would like to see in the future, that would really help us with planning and give us a sense of where you all are at with these issues. And if you'd say everything, then we have a lot of work cut out for us.
Then you have to present on it.
I can't guarantee we can do all of these, so we'll do our best. And if you have a topic that you don't see here, but that you really are longing to see a workshop on, please put it in the chat. Thanks, Jess. Glad it's been helpful. More on equity and theories, models, frameworks. Yes, yeah, definitely. And we have such amazing people doing that work. Some of whom are involved in the hub or are our friends and colleagues, and we can ask some favors of folks. Okay, great. Thanks. So we have probably the most requests for developing theory model framework driven analytic plans. That's exciting and interesting. Okay, that's very good to see. And then some interest in qualitative data collection instruments using theories, models, and frameworks, and more specific D&I, maybe a bit more on combining. So that is really helpful. Thank you all so much for completing the poll. We just wanted to draw your attention to a special issue of Frontiers in Health Services on theory and pragmatics of power and relationships and implementation that my colleagues and I are editing. Very excited about digging into power dynamics, equity issues, as many of you have indicated in the chat. So we look forward to seeing your papers. I just want to also point out that the our hub has a YouTube playlist with all of our past workshops available online. So we've also we've had a variety of beachside chats, which will continue throughout the year, and some methods workshops. So we hope you'll visit our playlist on YouTube to take advantage of these trainings. And I do want to just thank you all, but we're not stopping yet, so don't leave yet unless you don't want to hear any questions and comments. But we have about 10 minutes. I just want to take us out of slideshow. So we will be asking for your evaluation of this workshop. It really, really helps us. So if you can take just a couple of minutes to do that afterwards, we would be greatly appreciative, and email us if you have questions. And I'm going to take us out of slideshow so that we can see what you all are thinking about for about 10 minutes remaining.
So as people are queuing up, Alison, I'll let you and Elena direct to how you want to handle the discussion here. The slides are definitely going to be made available. We had another question in the beginning one. Alison or Elena can tell you how, or put in chat when and how they'll be available. Let's put that in chat. I would just like to editorialize a bit and really second Alison's notion about the playlist. I found that just wonderful that she does, and then add to it there's a wonderful series of videos, many of them really brief, that Rachel Sheldon, Anna Bauman, and I apologize, but I forget who else, have put together on D&I issues. And I'm sure somebody on here, can look that up if they don't know it. It's a YouTube channel, but it is a great resource also, particularly for communicating, I find, with other audiences. When you want to talk with a lay audience or something, you can hear from the expert, trying to explain their model there. And then the last thing is, there is so much incredible work going on here, as Alison mentioned, about equity and the interface between implementation science and equity. I've been really pleased to see several groups, cross-cutting work groups at NIH doing this. We were fortunate to get the supplement to add equity models there. I personally really like the Woodward et al. Model that was in here, if you get the slide, to think about it. But a lot doing, I'm sure some of you either can and will be contributing to that literature. We still have a lot to do. And there's and again, there's so many dimensions and issues involved with equity, but it's a clear focus. The other thing that I would say, and I'll shut up here, is that there are a few models out there on sustainability or sustainment now. Again, Rachel Shelton and colleagues have been real active in that, but I think we still have a lot to learn. In some ways, that's kind of the next frontier, I think, is looking at those issues of, I would say, especially together, equity and sustainment or sustainability.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree, and have also noticed, Russ and I are both part of IS2 and various other training programs that are really taking a much more explicit focus on equity and making that more front and center in our implementation work, which is a great turn of events and also an area for, I think, a lot of growth and evolution and innovation. There's some hard work that we need to do in this field to think about how disparities intersect with the work that we're doing in implementation. And so it's just amazing to see the thinking and the work that's going on in that area. So thank you for highlighting those. And yes, there are several sustainability frameworks we could have also put in. So that's a whole other topic that we could cover in a workshop too. And adaptations, there's a lot of models related to adaptations too. So just when you think you've covered some bases, you realize there are 25 others that we should have covered. But folks are saying that this has helped to demystify things, which is great. Requests for how frameworks have been applied in the ways that we've emphasized, like combining, so maybe a little bit more of application of theories, models, and frameworks, which is certainly possible, I think, considering the great team that I have in this hub. And it's probably going to be too much for me to scroll through and find folks' questions. So I would say if you have some questions now that we've made our way through. Okay, Elena, thank you so much. She curated a question for us, which was from Ometo, how to start using a model when the original study didn't use a D&I model, but now after this webinar, we see that that's important. Great question. I'll take it for a minute and then rest of you have thoughts as well. I think this may be somewhat of an answer. When I was doing a D&I study, a hybrid type 2 study, it was the first study that I had done outside of the first implementation study I had done outside of the VA. And I was doing an implementation study in community-based HIV service organizations. And I don't think I had known until I did that study how permeable these context, inner and outer context lines are, really not even lines, but how much movement there is between inner and outer context. And I hadn't started the design of that study with CFIR, but I learned that the external context dimension of CFIR would be a really helpful way to think about what we were finding in our data. And so we applied it analytically to understanding the role of external context in implementation, which was very unexpected for us, how much the external context was affecting what we were doing in the inner context. So that it's possible to apply models as analytic tools. That's one option for you. Of course, moving forward, you can add them in. It can be hard to retrofit them, of course, if the study was set up in a different way, but it might be that you find constructs that are helpful from models or frameworks that you can use to help interpret your findings, maybe set up next steps for the study. Russ, do you have other thoughts about that?
I don't. I couldn't add to that. That's good. Let's take another question. I think that was great.
We have just a few minutes left. Does anyone else have a burning question? We're getting thank yous. And thank you all for being here with us today. And we can also take a look at the chat if there's anything that hasn't been addressed when we email you all afterwards. We can see if there are any things that we haven't touched on.
Yeah. For the one question, I'll just say about examples, combining and using or adapting. I'm pretty sure the CFR website has some examples. I know our Reaim one does, of how to adapt and combine in particular. And then there are a few examples on the tool that I was, belaboring, probably beating to death today, of how they've been used. I would say probably the single most frequent one, doesn't mean it's the best one, has been to combine CFR, again, thinking about contextual factors with Reaim outcomes has been what I've seen the most often. Again, doesn't mean that's the best or what you should do.
Yeah, and I've seen some combinations with, we didn't put up the theoretical domains framework, but there's been a lot of interesting work combining TDF and other models and frameworks. So yeah, we can pull together some examples of those for a future session. And that'll keep us busy. So another question, any evidence that using these models leads to better outcomes? That's a good closing question.
That is, I actually am not aware off the top of my head of any head-to-head comparisons, or if we would say, direct experimental randomized comparisons. There have been a number of meta-analyses that have done that show that, first of all, it's kind of distressing that, particularly in our field, how seldom they're still used today, not near as much as they should be. But second, they show there's a correlation that studies that use models produce better overall outcomes in a meta-analysis than those that don't. But that has a lot of flaws and alternative interpretations, and that it could just be it's a more sophisticated research team that uses the model and rather than that particular model itself. And I've often seen, or I'm not sure, I can think of maybe more one or two actual direct comparisons of different models, if you really wanted to talk about advancing the science. But Alison?
I can't think of any either. And I think this is another area for a lot of thinking to happen with our up and coming implementation scientists that are getting trained in all these various programs. So if that's something that you want to do, I think the field would be very receptive to that. And I feel like I can look back on some of my studies and say I could have done more in that area. That is addressed in that Kisloff paper that we cited earlier. There's a very interesting, powerful critique of where and how we're using theory and whether we're doing enough. And I think there's still a lot of potential for this because we, I think to keep advancing this idea that you need these for this type of work, we need that parallel indication that it actually makes our work better. It makes it easier to organize it. I can be sure of that. Does it make our outcomes better? I think we still have an open question there.
Yep.
Yep. So I think we need to finish up because we're at our time. So I just want to thank you all so much for joining us today. This was a lot of fun. Thank you, Russ, for doing this with me, and to our hub for hosting this. Really appreciate all of your wisdom and kindness and availability for this, and really thankful to all of you for being interested in this topic. Russ, anything you want to say before we wrap up?
Nope, just thank you. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Really enjoyed the chat conversations also.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Russ and Elena. Bye.